The year was 1107, and Jerusalem's ancient stones were slick with blood. Across the scorching desert landscape of the Holy Land, where prophets once walked and empires had risen and fallen, a new kind of warfare was about to unfold, one that would defy every military principle known to medieval commanders. The numbers alone should have made this battle impossible. 800 Viking warriors, their longships beached on distant shores, stood against a Muslim army that stretched beyond the horizon like a sea of steel and silk. What happened next would become one of history's most extraordinary military encounters. A clash so improbable that chroniclers struggled to record it without sounding like they were spinning fairy tales. This wasn't just another skirmish in the endless cycle of crusading violence. This was a testament to what happens when northern fury meets desert warfare, when the descendants of sea raiders find themselves fighting a holy war in a land of sand and stone. The popular imagination has sanitized the Crusades into something almost romantic. Noble knights riding forth to reclaim sacred ground, their banners bright against Jerusalem's golden walls. But the reality was far more brutal and infinitely more complex. These were wars of survival, desperation, and calculated brutality, where survival meant adapting to an alien landscape and an enemy who knew every grain of sand in their homeland. King Sigurd of Norway, known as the Crusader, had brought his fleet across treacherous seas with dreams of glory and salvation. His warriors were the sons of men who had terrorized Europe's coastlines for centuries. Raiders whose ancestors had carved kingdoms from chaos with nothing but iron will and sharp steel. But the Holy Land would test them in ways that no English monastery or French village ever had. Today we examine the unflinching reality of how 800 Northmen found themselves surrounded by an army 50 times their size, and what happened when Viking battle fury collided with the sophisticated military machine of medieval Islam. To understand the full impossibility of what these warriors achieved, we must first grasp the world that created this confrontation. The early 12th century marked a critical turning point in the crusading movement. The initial wave of religious fervor that had captured Jerusalem in 1099 was beginning to fade, replaced by the hard realities of maintaining Christian kingdoms in hostile territory. The Frankish states carved from Muslim lands were constantly under siege, their survival dependent on a steady stream of Western reinforcements and the delicate balance of Middle Eastern politics. Into this volatile environment sailed Sigurd Magnusson, a king driven by more than mere religious conviction. Norway in the early 1100s was a realm still finding its identity, caught between its pagan past and Christian future. For Sigurd, the crusade represented an opportunity to establish Norway as a major European power while securing his own place in the chronicles of Christendom. His fleet of 60 longships carried not just warriors, but the ambitions of an entire kingdom. The Vikings who followed Sigurd eastward were not the savage raiders of popular legend, though that ferocity still burned within them. These were professional warriors from a society that had evolved far beyond simple piracy. They understood siege warfare, naval combat, and the complex logistics of long-distance campaigns. Their weapons were masterfully crafted, their armor practical yet effective, and their tactical knowledge honed through generations of constant warfare. But the Muslim forces they would face represented a military tradition every bit as sophisticated and far more familiar with the terrain. The Fatimid Caliphate controlled Egypt and much of the eastern Mediterranean through a combination of disciplined infantry, swift cavalry, and siege engines that could reduce stone walls to rubble. Their commanders had been fighting crusaders for over a decade, learning to counter Western heavy cavalry with mobility, superior numbers, and intimate knowledge of local conditions. The strategic situation in 1107 was particularly precarious for the Crusader states. Baldwin I of Jerusalem was struggling to maintain control over his fractured kingdom while facing pressure from multiple Muslim armies. The arrival of Sigurd's fleet represented a desperately needed infusion of fresh troops, But it also meant another mouth to feed in a land where logistics could determine the outcome of campaigns more decisively than any battlefield victory. Sigurd's initial campaigns in the Holy Land had been relatively successful. His fleet had captured several coastal cities, demonstrating the continued effectiveness of Viking naval warfare, even in Mediterranean waters. The sight of dragon-prowed longships appearing on the horizon struck terror into Muslim coastal communities who had grown accustomed to fighting land-based Frankish knights, but had little experience with seaborne assault. The Norwegian king's reputation grew with each victory, but so did the attention of his enemies. Muslim commanders began to recognize that this northern fleet represented a new type of threat, requiring a different response. Unlike the Frankish nobles who sought to establish permanent holdings, the Vikings appeared more interested in rapid strikes and mobile warfare, tactics that could potentially unravel the careful defensive strategies that had contained previous Crusader advances. The political landscape of the region added another layer of complexity to the approaching confrontation. The Muslim world was far from unified, with different factions pursuing their own agendas, even as they faced a common Christian enemy. Some rulers saw an opportunity to eliminate this Viking threat, while simultaneously weakening their Muslim rivals. Others calculated that allowing the Northmen to exhaust themselves against prepared defenses might serve their interests better than direct confrontation. For the Vikings themselves, the Holy Land presented challenges unlike anything their fathers had faced. The desert heat that could kill a man in full armor, the scarcity of fresh water, the alien tactics of enemies who struck like lightning and vanished into landscapes that offered no familiar landmarks. These were tests that no amount of northern courage could simply overcome through force of arms. Yet Sigurd's warriors adapted with the pragmatic flexibility that had made their ancestors successful across Europe. They modified their equipment for desert warfare, learned to fight in the crushing heat of midday sun, and developed new tactical approaches that combined their traditional strengths with lessons learned from watching their Frankish allies. The dragon ships that had carried them across northern seas were beached and converted into fortified camps, their hulls providing unexpected advantages in siege warfare. The intelligence networks that crisscrossed the medieval Middle East began reporting disturbing news to Muslim commanders. These Vikings were not behaving like typical crusaders. They showed no interest in establishing permanent settlements or following the conventional patterns of Frankish warfare. Instead, they operated more like a natural disaster, appearing suddenly, striking with overwhelming force, then disappearing before effective countermeasures could be organized. By late 1107, it became clear that something would have to be done about the Norwegian threat. The coastal cities that had fallen to Sigurd's forces represented more than mere territorial losses. They were strategic positions that could serve as bases for further Viking expansion. More troubling still, the success of these northern warriors was inspiring other Crusader forces and potentially attracting additional reinforcements from Europe. The decision to marshal a massive army against Sigurd's relatively small force reflected both the perceived threat and the political calculations of Muslim leaders who saw an opportunity to demonstrate their power. 40,000 warriors represented an enormous commitment of resources, but it also sent a clear message to other potential invaders about the price of challenging established authority in the Holy Land. As the great army assembled in the desert, its commanders faced their own challenges. Coordinating such a massive force required logistical expertise that strained even experienced Muslim administrators. Different contingents brought their own tactical preferences, languages, and internal rivalries that had to be managed alongside the primary military objective. The very size that should have guaranteed victory also created vulnerabilities that a cunning enemy might exploit. The stage was set for a confrontation that would test everything both sides thought they knew about warfare, faith, and survival in one of history's most unforgiving theaters of conflict. The heat shimmered off the sand as scouts brought word that would change everything. Sigurd's 800 warriors had been tracked to a narrow valley where ancient caravan routes converged. a place where the desert floor was littered with the bones of previous armies that had chosen poorly. The Muslim commanders studied their maps with growing satisfaction. Here was terrain that would negate every advantage these northern raiders possessed. The trap was elegant in its simplicity. High ridges surrounded the valley on three sides, leaving only one viable escape route that could be easily blocked by a fraction of the assembled force. The remaining 39,000 warriors would descend like an avalanche of steel, crushing the Vikings against the valley floor where their legendary mobility would count for nothing. It was a textbook example of how superior numbers and local knowledge could overcome even the most ferocious opponents. But Sigurd Magnusson had not survived the treacherous politics of medieval Norway by walking blindly into obvious traps. His scouts had been mapping the region for weeks, identifying not just the main routes, but the forgotten paths that desert nomads used when the great armies passed through. More importantly, they had discovered something the Muslim commanders had overlooked in their eagerness to corner their prey: underground springs that could sustain a besieged force far longer than anyone expected. The Norwegian king called his war council as the sun set behind the distant mountains, painting the desert in shades of blood and gold. Around the flickering campfires sat men whose grandfathers had stood in shield walls against Saxon kings, who had carved runes of victory on Irish monastery stones, who had sailed through storms that swallowed lesser warriors whole. These were not men who cowered before impossible odds. They were men who transformed impossible odds into sagas. The plan that emerged from that council would have seemed like madness to conventional military minds. Rather than attempt to break out of the valley before the trap closed, Sigurd proposed to let himself be surrounded completely. The Vikings would use the narrow confines to their advantage, creating killing zones where numbers meant nothing and individual skill meant everything. They would turn the trap into a fortress and the fortress into a slaughter ground. The psychological warfare began before the first arrow was loosed. As dawn broke over the valley, the Muslim army found their prey arranged not in desperate defensive positions, but in perfect battle lines, shields locked and spears gleaming. The dragon banners that had terrified coastlines from Ireland to Sicily snapped in the morning wind, and from 800 throats rose the ancient war songs that had once echoed across frozen fjords. The sound was unlike anything the desert warriors had heard, not the refined war cries of Frankish knights or the religious chants of other crusader armies, but something primal and terrifying that seemed to emerge from the earth itself. Veterans who had faced countless enemies felt an unfamiliar chill despite the rising heat, while younger warriors gripped their weapons with suddenly sweaty palms. The first assault came at mid-morning, wave after wave of mounted archers seeking to weaken the Viking formation with volleys of arrows before the infantry moved in for the kill. But Sigurd's men had learned from watching Frankish failures against similar tactics. Their shields formed an impenetrable roof over their heads, while selected warriors with captured crossbows returned fire with devastating precision, picking off commanders and disrupting the carefully coordinated attacks. What followed was a masterclass in defensive warfare that chroniclers would struggle to describe adequately. The Vikings had transformed their small section of valley floor into a maze of obstacles, using everything from overturned supply wagons to carefully placed boulders. Each approach was channeled into predetermined kill zones where northern axes and swords could do their terrible work unimpeded by enemy numbers. The Muslim commanders found themselves facing a tactical nightmare. Their overwhelming numerical advantage meant nothing when only a few dozen warriors could engage the enemy at any given moment. Worse still, each assault wave that broke against the Viking defenses left behind equipment and weapons that the Northmen immediately incorporated into their own arsenal. The trap was slowly becoming a treasure trove for their intended victims. By noon, the desert sand was dark with blood from both sides, but the mathematics of attrition were working in an unexpected direction. The Vikings, fighting from prepared positions with limited frontage to defend, were losing men at a fraction of the rate their attackers suffered. More troubling for the Muslim force, The initial confidence of easy victory was giving way to growing uncertainty as word spread through the ranks about the ferocity of northern resistance. The afternoon brought new tactics, as desperate commanders threw everything they had at the seemingly impregnable Viking position. Siege engines dragged across the desert began hurling massive stones at the northern lines, while fire arrows sought to ignite anything combustible within the defensive perimeter. Greek fire, that terrible incendiary weapon that had terrorized so many previous enemies, was deployed in massive quantities against positions that should have been reduced to ash within hours. Yet still the dragon banners flew, and still the war songs echoed off the valley walls. Sigurd himself fought in the front ranks, his royal armor blackened with smoke and gore, his sword arm moving with the mechanical precision of a man born to war. Around him, his warriors performed feats that would be remembered in skaldic poetry for generations. Men who held gaps in the shield wall single-handed, archers who never seemed to miss their marks, berserkers whose fury burned so bright that enemies fled rather than face them directly. The turning point came as shadows began to lengthen across the blood-soaked sand. A massive assault by the elite guard units of 3 different emirs had finally broken through the outer defenses, and for a moment, it seemed the end had come. Muslim warriors poured through the gap like water through a dam, their victory cries echoing off the valley walls as they prepared to finish the stubborn Northmen once and for all. But Sigurd had been waiting for exactly this moment, when enemy commanders would commit their reserves to what appeared to be the decisive breakthrough. Hidden passages carved into the valley walls during the night disgorged fresh Viking warriors who struck the overextended Muslim forces from behind, while concealed caches of weapons allowed the defenders to rearm themselves with captured equipment superior to what they had started with. The slaughter that followed was so complete that surviving Muslim chroniclers would later claim supernatural intervention to explain how their overwhelming advantage had transformed into catastrophic defeat. In the space of minutes, the flower of 3 armies lay dead or dying on ground that had been meant to serve as a Viking graveyard. As the sun set behind the mountains that had witnessed this impossible victory, the surviving Muslim forces withdrew into the desert, leaving behind a field of honor that would be remembered as long as men told stories of war. 800 Vikings had not merely survived against 40,000 enemies. They had shattered them so completely that the very concept of overwhelming numbers would never again seem like a guarantee of victory in the Holy Land. The battle's aftermath rippled across the medieval world like stones cast into still water. In the courts of Europe, Sigurd's achievement became the stuff of legend, inspiring a new generation of warriors to seek their fortunes in distant lands. In the Muslim world, military commanders began developing entirely new approaches to warfare, recognizing that the old certainties about tactics and strategy had died in that blood-soaked valley alongside so many of their finest soldiers. But perhaps the most profound impact was on the nature of the Crusades themselves. The Vikings had proven that success in the Holy Land required more than religious fervor or noble birth. It demanded the kind of adaptability, tactical brilliance, and sheer bloody-minded determination that had once carried dragon ships across unknown seas to distant shores. The 800 who stood that day had achieved something far greater than military victory. They had demonstrated that when human will collides with impossible odds, the impossible sometimes yields. In a land where empires had risen and fallen, where prophets had walked and armies had marched since the dawn of recorded history, a handful of northern warriors had carved their names into the eternal record of human courage. Their saga reminds us that the greatest battles are not always won by the largest armies, but by those who refuse to accept defeat even when the entire world declares their cause hopeless.